Book of Jasher. The Book of Jasher, also known in Latin as the Book of the Just Ones, and in Greek as the Book of the Upright One. The Book of Jasher was most likely a collection or compilation of ancient Hebrew hymns and poems, extolling Israel's heroes and exploits in combat. When the Lord stopped the sun in the middle of the day during the Battle of Beth Horon, He mentioned the Book of Jasher in Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord on the day when the Lord handed over the Amorites to the sons of Israel. And Joshua said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, until the nation of Israel took vengeance upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the middle of the sky, and was in no hurry to go down for about a whole day. This happened during the miracle of the sun standing still. Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 to 14 may just relate the most amazing miracle of all time, the day the sun stood still. As soon as the other kings of Canaan heard of Israel's victories in battle, they banded together to fight against Joshua and Israel. But the people who lived in the city of Gibeon, as well as 3 other cities, came to the conclusion that fighting against the invaders would be pointless. They knew that the Israelites had been ordered to destroy all the heathen inhabitants of the land. On the other hand, they were aware that no such directives had been distributed to nations located outside of Canaan. They stood a chance of being spared if they were able to convince Joshua and his army that they had traveled a great distance to get there, from a faraway land. Therefore, in order to conceal their identities, they dressed in worn and torn clothing, and sandals that had been repaired. In addition to this, they carried with them rotten and stale bread, as well as wineskins that had been torn. They told Joshua that they had come from a very far nation, and everything about them seemed to substantiate the statement. They even spoke a language that Joshua could not recognize. Instead of consulting the Lord for guidance regarding the matter, the Israelites decided to enter into a covenant with the Gibeonites. After another 3 days, the deception was revealed. After hearing the Gibeonites had deserted to the Israelites, the kings of 5 Canaanite cities came to the conclusion that this left the central hilly sector exposed. As a result, they took the decision to launch an assault against Gibeon. Joshua received an appeal for help from the Gibeonites in the form of a request for military support. Joshua chapter 10, verses 7 to 13. So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army, including all the best fighting men. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel, so Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Horon, and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you moon over the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky, and delayed going down about a full day. Joshua included passages from the book of Jasher in his account of the battle, not because it was his only source of information. Instead, he was saying in effect, if you don't believe what I'm saying, go read it in the book of Jasher. This event is documented in that book as well. There is a book that is currently in circulation that is referred to as the Book of Jasher. But this book is not the same book that is mentioned in the Old Testament. Instead, this book is a forgery that dates back to the 18th century and claims to be a translation of the lost book of Jasher. There is also a more modern book written by the science fiction and fantasy author Benjamin Rosenbaum named The Book of Jasher, which is also available. This book is an entirely fictional work. The Book of Jasher is also mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verses 18 to 27 as containing the song or lament of the bow, a mournful funeral song composed by David. This took place at the same time that the Lord prevented David from participating in the battle in which Saul and Jonathan both perished. Instead, he was engaged in the conflict with the Amalekite invaders who had attacked Ziklag. A messenger brought the news of Saul's death to him after he had returned to Ziklag. The messenger arrived from the direction of the north. The messenger wore tattered clothing and bore dust on his head as symbolic representations of their grief. He told how he had found Saul, leaning wounded on his spear, as the enemy's forces drew near. He said that Saul asked him, an Amalekite, to administer the death blow, and that he complied with the king's request. This account of Saul's death is obviously in conflict with the one in 1 Samuel chapter 31, where Saul is said to have committed suicide. The most reasonable explanation is that the Amalekites' account was a lie. He believed that David, who would be thrilled to meet the one who had killed Saul, would reward him well for his service. Instead, David spent the entire day that day in intense mourning, and then in the evening, he issued an order for the Amalekite to be put to death, since he had murdered the anointed of the Lord. The Amalekites were the inveterate enemies of Israel. Saul lost the kingdom because he had failed to execute the Lord's wrath on them thoroughly. Some Amalekites had recently been killed by David and his men for their haul of Ziklag. So when this Amalekite arrived in camp and announced that he had killed Saul, it is little wonder that he received the sword and not a reward. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 to 18. Then David sang this dirge, funeral song, over Saul and his son Jonathan, and he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. It is undeniable that David's greatness can be measured by the fact that in the face of Saul's death, he cried bitterly rather than rejoiced. In addition to that, David wrote a heartbreaking lamentation that he dubbed the Song of the Bow. The Book of Jasher was likely a compilation of poems about significant figures in the history of the Israelite people. It was common practice for ancient monarchs to keep annals documenting their activities as rulers of their realms. It was not unusual for ancient prophets to play a part in establishing these records or providing a divine perspective on the events that transpired throughout history. As far as is known, it is no longer in existence and certainly is not part of inspired scripture. The book is considered to be part of the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is a collection of biblical works that are not considered canonical, but are connected to the canonical biblical books in some way. This means that these texts were written close to or a little after biblical events, and while they might reference biblical events, they are not recognized as part of the Bible. The Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch are only two examples of the many texts that fall under this category. The Apocrypha is a collection of writings that were written by Jewish authors before the New Testament. Many of these works were originally compiled in the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of Hebrew texts. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church both regard the works in question to be part of the canon of Scripture. However, Protestant denominations do not accept these books as canonical. Some examples are the first book of Esdras, the second book of Esdras, the book of Tobit, and the book of Judith. Most of these books have separate storylines and characters from the other books of the Bible. For example, the books of the Maccabees come after the Old Testament canon and describe the Maccabees revolting against empires that controlled Israel. If the biblical writers made mention of the book, why don't we include it in the Bible? Do we have any other instances of biblical authors placing secular texts in the Bible, or mentioning them? And what do we know about this book? The Book of Jasher, otherwise known as the Book of Just Ones, has likely been lost to time in its original form. We have several translations, one of which was produced in the 1700s and is quite misleading, but we do not know if the copy we currently have is an accurate reflection of the original material. However, according to the information that we do have, the Book of Jasher, like other apocryphal works, recounts the events that occurred from the beginning of time until Joshua's death. Essentially, the books that make up the Pentateuch, and a little bit beyond, along with certain discrepancies and variants. We don't know who wrote the Book of Jasher. Since Joshua makes mention of the book, the writer must have written the text before the time of the judges, even though the text also seems to talk about Joshua's death. Perhaps several writers compiled the 91-chapter book. Some Bibles do include the Book of Jasher, such as the Latin Vulgate Bible, but the Catholic Church apparently removed the book from the biblical canon at one point. Nevertheless, Christians should exercise discernment when reading something outside the biblical canon, as they do not contain God-breathed words. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 to 17. All Scripture is God-breathed, given by divine inspiration, and is profitable for instruction, for conviction of sin, for correction, of error and restoration to obedience, for training in righteousness, learning to live in conformity to God's will, both publicly and privately, behaving honorably with personal integrity and moral courage, so that the man of God may be complete and proficient, outfitted and thoroughly equipped for every good work. Why does this matter? Why should we know about the Book of Jasher? First, if the book had existed during the time of Joshua, we know that someone else documented the day when the sun stood still. Joshua chapter 10, verse 13. We also know that just because a verse in the Bible quotes or makes mention of an extra-biblical source does not make that source part of the Bible. Paul, after all, quoted pagan poets. This demonstrates to us that God can use any philosopher or any work to bring readers back to the scriptures found in the Bible. However, this does imply that we should examine apocryphal and other non-biblical works with extreme caution, as the Book of Jasher and other apocalyptic writing contain suspect authors, dates, and even contradictions with Scripture.